position that camera this time so that I can actually continue working here. Are we good? Mm-hmm. Very, very nice. Okay,
My head's not on.
Huh?
My head is not on.
Can you push the button?
It already is.
It already is. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Professional now.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, guys. So we're picking up where we left off before the break. We developed price floor today. The purpose of the price floor is to help producers, right? So they can actually sell at higher prices. And we see when the price floor is set a certain way, it actually may result in a gain in producer surplus, right? Here, it made producers $1.50 better off. The fact is, though, price floor is not the only way to do that. There are various policies that can accomplish the similar policy goal. What we're going to introduce now is an alternative policy called price support. Price support. What is the difference between supporting the price in order to benefit producers with a price support or supporting the price with a price floor? Well, it's basically like asking a question, what are the government's options if it wants to lift the price above equilibrium? Equilibrium is $5. Suppose the government wants to lift the price to $6. It can accomplish that goal with different measures. For example, it can impose price floor of $6. In other words, it mandates that price must not fall below $6 or if you dare to sell your product at less than $6, you're in violation of the regulation and you will go to jail, right? So that's one way the government can do it. The government can impose a price floor. Can you think of an alternative, a little bit less oppressive way in which the government could accomplish the same thing and lift the price from $5 to $6 without threatening any repercussions, without mandating anything? How about, guys, if the government itself becomes a buyer and makes an offer they can't refuse? What would the offer be?
They would subsidize the difference.
Or the government declares, we will buy any quantity at $6. And if you're a firm, you're a producer, you have a choice to sell to the government or sell to the private sector. In the private sector, equilibrium is $5. You can sell to the government at $6. Who are you going to be selling to if you're a firm? To the government. So if the private sector wants to buy anything, the private sector will have to pay how much? $6. Well, if the government offers to buy any quantity from firms at $6, if you as a private buyer want to buy, you also have to offer, you have to match, right, $6. And that's what we call price support. So let's see how the price support affects this market. So once again, let's suppose we have this market that's in equilibrium, and again the government decides firms need help, we need to lift the price from $5 to $6. Only this time we're going to use it, we're going to implement it using the price support. Once again we have demand, P equals 8 minus Q, we have supply, P equals 2 plus Q, slash quantity price. Same market, okay? Only now the government implements price support of $6. So you see, Here, price floor $6. Here, price support of $6. So tell me, what is the quantity supplied firms are willing and able to produce at price $6? What is the quantity supplied firms are willing and able to produce at the price $6? 4 units. Quantity supplied, 4 units. What is the quantity demanded buyers, consumers are willing and able to buy at that price? Quantity demanded is 2 units. See the difference? Well, there is none, right? So far, it basically looks identical. And let's jump straight to asking, what are the well-being consequences, surplus consequences of this policy? Let's first start with consumer surplus with price support. How are we going to find consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus is typically measured as the area of the top triangle, right? Here we measure this as the area of this top triangle. What do you think is consumer surplus here with price 6?
Top triangle again.
Top triangle, absolutely. How tall is it? 2 times 2 divided by 2 is $2. What is the impact of price support on consumer surplus? Reduces consumer surplus from $4.50 to $2. Is that surprising to you? Isn't that exactly the same impact on consumer surplus we've seen from price floor? Absolutely. How come price support, $6 price support, impacts consumers in exactly the same way as a $6 price floor?
So trying to help out firms.
Because it's the same impact on the price, right? Consumers, whether you have to pay $6 because the government imposed price floor, or you have to pay $6 because the government imposed price support, what do you care? Do you care? You have to pay $6. Makes you equally less well off, right? Your consumer surplus falls from $4.50, you used to enjoy an equilibrium, down to $2. That makes sense? So far, so good. Let's now take a look at producers, producer surplus. Typically, we measure producer surplus as the area of the bottom triangle. Here, of course, with price floor, it was not the entire bottom triangle, it was only part of the triangle, because consumers only bought 2 units, correct? Please start thinking out loud how to measure producer surplus with price support.
Would you do the whole triangle now?
Whole bottom triangle, right? Why?
Because you said the government would.
They're closing that
Somebody's already
gap.
bought it. In other words, this is what you're suggesting,
Yeah.
right? Area of the big triangle
So you'd go to.
as the measure of producer surplus.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And it is still true that consumers only buy 2 units, but the firms are now actually producing and selling 4 units. How can they do it if consumers only buy 2 units?
Because the government's buying the
Because
rest.
the government buys the rest. Exactly. So firms actually get to produce and sell 4 units. So let's take a look at the impact on producer surplus. How tall is the triangle?
4.
4. How wide is the triangle?
4.
4 times 4 is 16, divided by 2,
Hey,
$8. Question: does this policy meet or deliver its stated goal of increasing producer surplus? Absolutely. It increases producer surplus from $4.50 to $8. Now, is there a difference? Yes, question?
Yeah, I'm sure you're about to get to that, but my question was, so why would, there are obviously two different policies, so why if price support helps the producer in the end, which is it helps them more in the long run, why would the government even, why would the government even
Consider using that
consider-
one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Using price
That's a
support.
great question. And the truth is, this is actually a very simple concept. You don't have to distinguish between long run, short run. This is basically a static, simple comparison. So you don't even have to think about long run. The fact is, this policy definitely makes producers better off, right? This one also makes them better off. Here, producer surplus increases from 450 to 6, but here from 450 to 8, right? So the benefit to producers is a lot larger. So let's take this step by step. First of all, if you were a producer and you're lobbying the Congress to pass a policy, would you lobby the Congress to pass price support or price floor? Price support, naturally, right? Because your producer surplus is much higher. So yes, question.
So this is, you said this is all static, so it doesn't go back to macro where we talk about increased government spending or decreased government spending and all that stuff?
No, not really. No, not really. I mean, of course, we can then put it in the bigger context, and we will actually talk about some bigger issues. We will talk about examples, how this was used and why and when and so on and so forth. But no, this is not necessarily a macro story. In other words, when I'm talking policies here, guys, I understand that those of you who remember your macro, when I use the word policies, you immediately start probably thinking fiscal monetary, right?
Well, I was thinking like government spending, so the government's
fiscal
subsidizing, yeah.
This is not subsidy.
Okay.
We will study subsidy. But what I want to tell you that in this class, by policies, we don't necessarily mean policies we talked about in that previous class. In that previous class, we studied macroeconomic policies, right? And that was the government spending, taxes, and that sort of thing. Here, we're talking about policies in terms of microeconomic policies, targeted at one individual market. So we don't even have to go into macro ramifications, and definitely not into long run, short run, and so on. No need to do that, okay? Just keeping it simple. So, look, just first glance tells you that producers obviously prefer price support because it increases producer surplus a lot more. But guys, let me point your attention to one more peculiar aspect. Please don't write anything down. Look, price floor made producers better off, but it made consumers a lot worse off, right? So the price floor resulted in deadweight loss, total surplus decrease, right? Take a look at the impact of price support. It obviously makes consumers worse off, just like that one. How much are consumers worse off? $2.50. Right? But that's the same change we've seen before. Producers, of course, benefit. How much are producers benefiting from this policy? How much is the producer surplus rising? What? 350? Whoa. So yes, it is a policy. It makes some people better off, some people worse off. But it actually makes those who benefit a lot better off than the harm it does to those who are worse off. Guys, did we just stumble upon the magical policy that increases total surplus? Did we just stumble on a policy that increases efficiency of the market? Because if yes, then we should definitely impose price support on all the American markets and we become a richer country. What do you think?
What about dead weight loss?
Well, that's what I'm asking you. There is no dead weight, that based on these numbers, there is no dead weight loss. There seems to be a live weight gain, right? Wow. This is interesting. Guys, I told you, policies we're going to be studying here end up in dead weight loss, cause inefficiency, right? Because they knock the market out of equilibrium. Is this market in equilibrium? Definitely not. We knocked it out of equilibrium. Where's the inefficiency? There not only seems to be no inefficiency, there seems to be efficiency gain.
Because the government is picking up the slack.
Excuse me?
Because the government is covering what was once lost.
You are a dangerous citizen. You see right through it. Where does that tremendous gain of firms, of producers, come from? It comes from the fact that the government actively supports the price by purchasing the surplus. In other words, here firms or producers benefit so much only because they actually end up producing and selling 4 units as opposed to 2 units. But they're only producing and selling 4 units because the government buys 2 units. But the government buys those 2 units. It means the government incurs cost, right? What is the cost to the government? What is the government expenditure? Government expenditure associated with this policy. How much does the government use the word subsidy? I don't use the word subsidy here because we will study subsidy separately as a different policy. But how much money does the government spend supporting this price?
Would it be $12 for 2?
How did you find it?
$6 times 2.
Because the government picks up the excess supply, which is 2 units, and purchases it for $6 each, correct? So 2 times 6 is $12. Absolutely. Now my question is, do you think this government expenditure adds to total surplus or subtracts from total surplus?
Subtract.
It subtracts, it's a cost. It subtracts from total surplus. So consumer surplus decreases by $250. Producer surplus increases by $350. But total surplus is then further reduced by 12. What happens to total surplus then? Plus 350 minus 250 is 1. 1 minus 12 is negative 11. So it takes away $11 from total surplus. If you start in equilibrium with total surplus of 9 and you take away 11, you end up with a deadweight loss of $11, right? So how much is 2 plus 8 minus 12? Total surplus, negative 2. You start with 9, you end up with negative 2, you lost 11, right? So it is a huge deadweight loss. All right, guys. So, these 2 policies that formally look a lot similar end up impacting the market in different ways. While causing the same harm to consumers, they benefit producers differently. This one, price support, benefits producers vastly better. Price support also benefits producers not quite as much.
What is the G in government?
Government expenditure. Government expenditure associated with that price support. So we know that producers would prefer price support. How about you guys as voters? Are you going to support that kind of policy? Why not?
Taxes would go up.
Because it's associated with a huge deadweight loss. It is extremely inefficient. And ultimately, of course, somebody has to pick up the tab, right? So it's going to impact you in a number of ways. It's going to impoverish America. You might, of course, ask, why would anyone consider a policy like that as opposed to policy like this? Well, obviously, policy like this is preferred by producers. When producers lobby, they will lobby for a policy like that. Now, how do we know that this is the way it works? As usual, guys, we know it because we've seen it happen, right? Can you think of an example of a market where price support actually used to be used? We used to implement price support in America. Can you think of a sector or an industry where this was used, guys?
Housing market?
The housing market?
Necessarily. Not farming, guys, agriculture. Okay? I mean, there's a long history of supporting farmers in this country. In most industrialized countries, farmers get all kinds of support from the government, either in the form of price support, price floors, subsidies, you name it, right? So farmers tend to get all kinds of government help. Price support was one of the policies that at a certain period of time after World War II, for a couple of decades, was quite widely used. Why? Because it helped farmers tremendously. Farmers lobbied for that policy. Do we still use price support widely? No longer. Why not?
Well,
Because it was awfully inefficient. It is a very inefficient policy. Do we still help farmers, guys, in this country? Absolutely. There's a number of policies aimed at helping the farmers. I don't know if you remember, just a few weeks ago, there was a great debate about the new farm bill. It's still being analyzed. If you're interested, you can look it up. You can read various sources on farm bill, and you will read about a number of various ways farmers are still being helped with government policies. But price support is really not among them. Price support is a thing of the past. Why? It was extremely inefficient, number one. Number two, when you take a look at it, doesn't it raise some questions, guys? Let me remind you, price support works as long as the government commits itself to doing what?
Buying surplus.
Buying a ton of that output. Now, if this is, for example, corn, the government commits itself to buying millions of tons of corn.
well, in this example, the government would be committing to buying half of what the producer makes.
This is,
So you
let's
think
say it's a
about it
little
that
bit
way.
exaggerated.
Well, yeah, I'm sure it's exaggerated, but I mean, that's still a lot.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, so basically the policy works by government committing and actually buying large quantities of agricultural products. Guys, this was happening during Cold War, 60s, 70s. Our government was actually buying large quantities of agricultural products. Did you ever buy yourself cornflakes, Uncle Sam's brand? Oh, Kellogg's, right? That's what you're buying, or whatever, some generic. But it's not the. What does the government need corn for? What did the government use that corn for that the government actually purchased? What was it used for, guys? Do you have any intuition for what our government was doing with millions of tons of corn it was purchasing from our farmers over a period of many, many years?
Ethanol?
No, back then it was not ethanol. I've heard it.
Oil.
Not oil. What about oil? No. Guys, foreign aid. Government used it to prop up friendly regimes around the world. It was part of our Cold War strategy. Okay? What's the meaning of it? How did it work? How was it supposed to help our national interest, guys? What was Cold War all about?
Just basically
Let's
an
take a
arms
few
race.
minutes to put it in that context.
Just an arms race. Nothing really ever happened. It was just kind of flexing. back
Between
and
who
forth.
and who?
Soviet Union.
Soviet Union and the United
Was-
States.
Yeah,
Of course,
Soviet
our
Union, Cuba, and then us.
absolutely. And the goal of the Soviet Union was to basically expand the camp of communist countries, right? The bloc of countries that were loyal to the Soviet Union and adopted their ideology, their economy, and that sort of thing, right? And well, look, guys, Soviet Union was established less than 100 years ago, 1917, right? It was the first communist country on earth. Until World War II, it was basically the only communist country. I mean, there was Mongolia somewhere in 1926 or something. But essentially, it was Soviet Union. It's only after World War II that Soviet Union actually expanded communism into other countries and started building what became known as the communist bloc of countries, right? Other nations that were turning communist. What do you think the goal of the Soviet Union was? Why did they do it? Why do you go around the world and turn nations into communist nations? Well, they really had a goal to spread communism around the world and eventually turn the world, I guess, into a communist world. Basically to obliterate Western democracies and market economies and turn the whole world into one big, ginormous communist bloc. But of course, there were nations such as the United States, our allies, who didn't like that idea. So basically, in the beginning, we were on the defensive. Was the Soviet Union actually successful in those late 40s, 50s?
Red Scare.
Red Scare. They were very successful, guys, right? In 5 years after World War II, suddenly Eastern Europe was turning communist. China was turning communist, right? Other countries around the world started flirting with communism. In the 50s, the impact of Soviet Union was spreading throughout Africa, throughout Asia. Countries were suddenly turning socialist, communist, and so on, right? Eventually Latin America. And of course, at some point, that clash found its peak at Cuban crisis, right? That was basically the effort by the Soviets to install nuclear weapons on the communist island of Cuba. We didn't like that, right? You have to say stop at some point. Well, the question is, how are you going to stop that expansion? And the strategy we were using at that time was to simply make sure that the countries that were sort of loyal to us also remain loyal to us. How are you going to buy someone's loyalty? For example, by food aid, right? When you're talking about a lot of Latin American countries, a lot of African countries, a lot of Asian countries, countries that oftentimes struggled to feed their population, you send them agricultural, yeah, absolutely, wheat and so on, agricultural products. Basically make a pact. As long as you don't let your country turn communist, we're going to support you with food, we're going to support you with military aid, we're going to support you with whatever, right? That's the way we did it, guys. In the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. How did it work out for us? Is that still our preferred way of doing business and establishing our own interests? Well, there were a lot of setbacks. First of all, one of those major conflicts of the Cold War, of course, we got dragged into Vietnam War, late 60s, early 70s, right? Why? Why did we go to Vietnam? What was our interest in Vietnam? Is Vietnam right on our borders? No, it's the other side of the world. Why did America get involved in Vietnam? Guys. because communism was spreading in Vietnam. And it was threatening to control the entire country. If the country would turn communist, it would be another victory for Soviet expansion into that part of the world. And we didn't want to let that happen. So we were actually supporting the South Vietnamese regime that was loyal to us, trying to keep communism at bay, right? It was all about the same thing. It was just a chapter in that long story. Why did we run into these nasty conflicts where ultimately we did not succeed? Vietnam eventually turned communist, right? We were not able to stop spread communism in Vietnam. What was the problem? Where was the mistake in the overall strategy? I'm not asking why, we didn't win war in Vietnam. Now I'm asking if you can see a problem with the strategy. Guys, when you see a country, you don't want to turn communist, and you start supplying them with food aid and military aid, who exactly in that country are you supporting?
The government.
Say it loud?
The government.
The government. In other words, you send food and military aid to the existing government in that country, right? So for example, here on our doorstep, south of us, in Central America, there were these small countries, right? Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and so on and so forth. Did the Soviets try to turn those countries communists? Did they try to? Of course they tried. So we instead tried to support the existing governments, provide them with all kinds of aid to help them stabilize and stay loyal to us, rather than the Soviets. What's the problem with that? Okay guys, what kinds of governments did Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua have? Nice, democratic, civilized, tolerant, open-minded, loving, gentle, and caring governments of the people, by the people, for the people of Guatemala? Yes or no?
No.
What kinds of governments were those? Nasty, psychopathic, oppressive, murderous, military juntas. Horrible regimes, some of the worst governments in the world. Hated by their own people, who were trying to get rid of those governments because they were impoverished, hungry, dying, disappearing. What chance do you think those nations stood in their fight and opposition to their own oppressive governments? Not very good, because those nasty governments were getting aid from us. In other words, in that clash, historical clash after World War II, when we were trying to stem the spread of communism around the world, we ended up supporting some of the nastiest, anti-democratic, oppressive regimes on earth. Does that really serve our long-term interest? If there's a nation that suffers 10 years, 20 years under nasty murderous regime only because America supports that regime, does it win us a lot of sympathy from those nations? No. Ultimately, it turned out to be liability. It was undermining our long-term interests in various regions around the world. So are we still doing it? Are we on a massive basis supporting the worst governments around the world? No more. Not anymore. When did the change take place, guys? When did we switch from doing this and using that food to prop up nasty regimes to actually doing our foreign policy and establishing our national interest in a more sophisticated way? When did the change take place? Guys, it happened during the perhaps least appreciated, or one of the least appreciated post-World War II presidencies, and that was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter's presidency. I mean, Jimmy Carter is criticized as one of the least effective presidents, right, after World War II, just one-time president, all kinds of bad things happened during his presidency and so on and so forth. One thing that many people are not aware of is that Jimmy Carter in those 4 years managed to completely redefine American foreign policy paradigm. And during that presidency, we stopped doing this. And we stopped using that food to prop up nasty regimes. Instead, what did we choose to be our fundamental yardstick of who is our friend? It's not enough that you're against communists. It's not enough to be America's friend.
Be democratic.
You have to respect human rights, right? Human rights, guys. We're big on human rights, right? We are the most important protector of human rights on a global scale. But it wasn't always like that. It is like that basically since late 70s, when President Carter and his administration introduced human rights as the paradigm of the American foreign policy. Now you might say, okay, wait a second. One of our major allies in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia, right? Does Saudi Arabia have the strongest record on human rights? No? Can you think of some problems with human rights in Saudi Arabia?
People killing people.
People killing people? Well,
Government's not-
I don't think people kill people in the world more than in America. I think in America people kill other people more than anywhere else. What do you mean by people kill people?
I mean, I guess they get away with it.
Well, for example, public executions, right? All kinds of forms of weird punishment that we wouldn't go for in this country, okay? Strange judicial system, okay? Have you ever seen women's passport, what it looks like in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
What does
think
it
so.
look? Hmm?
They're like covered up.
Oh, when taking a picture, I'm sure, but you wouldn't have a passport. You wouldn't have a driver license.
Yeah.
Women are not allowed to drive in that country. You don't even have a right to drive a car, right? You don't have a right to walk in the street alone, and so on and so on. In other words, there's all kinds of things we take absolutely for granted are simply not honored in that country. Yet it is one of our allies, right? So the bottom line is, yes, human rights are our paradigm. It doesn't mean we adhere to it 100% of the time. Our policies, of course, are very flexible and pragmatic. But generally speaking, now we tend not to be friends with oppressive governments. And we tend to promote democracy, market economy, and freedom. That makes sense? That's the whole idea. So that's how this discussion fits in that broader narrative of policy and global issues and so on and so forth. Do you have any questions about price support? That makes sense? So, yes, question.
So to calculate the deadweight loss, are you just subtracting the 2, the 8, and the 1 from the 12?
Yeah, basically. Basically, yes. It's like 3 plus 350 minus 250 minus 12. Or you can calculate total surplus, right? Which is 2 plus 8 minus 12 is 10 minus 12 is negative 2, right? It was 9, now it's negative 2. How much has it fallen? By 11, right? It's a loss of $11. So, very good. So now you saw how this analysis can be used to assess inefficiency of alternative policies designed to accomplish a similar policy goal, to help farmers or producers to increase price from $5 in equilibrium to $6 after the policy. And you understand that, of course, producers would support this policy, but of course it's a policy that's immensely inefficient. That's why we need to analyze policies before we implement them, estimate their efficiency consequences so that we can actually optimize our policies, right? Choose the ones that cause the least amount of inefficiency. Okay, guys, to put this in a better perspective, maybe more intuitive perspective. So any questions? No questions. Can I erase this? Very good. Let me motivate this idea of a deadweight loss with an intuitive example. Suppose in America we are producing pizza, and we produce a huge pizza because this is a big country, we have a big economy, and we're producing a huge pizza. Do we then distribute that pizza equally in this country, equitably? Does everyone get the same slice in this country? No. You have some people who have large slices, right? And then some people who get really small slices, right? So distribution is quite unequal. Now, are there policies we could use to change the distribution of pizza? Sure, we will see tax, subsidy, possibly other policies that may change the distribution of pizza. And of course, the purpose of a policy like that, if people decide to go for a policy like that, the purpose of a policy like that would be to have that same pie of pizza only distributed neatly and equitably, right? And a lot of people would consider that to be fair, right? Everybody the same slice of pizza. Does it really work that way? Is it possible? Guys, this was an ideal followed by all kinds of experimenters, social scientists, visionaries for hundreds of years, for like 300 years. People were thinking how to accomplish this, how to make sure that we don't have the super rich and we don't have the poor. How can we have a prosperous economy producing a huge pie of goods and services that we all share fairly in some sense? So various policies have been implemented. Some of those policies we have just studied. And every single time we studied a policy, ceiling, floor, support, there was this deadweight loss that resulted. Sometimes big, sometimes small, but always a deadweight loss. What is that deadweight loss in the context of this idea? Well, it turns out that when you take a market economy that bakes this big pizza, you impose these policies on it. As you start cutting that pie in different proportions, something really, really bizarre happens to the pie. What happens to the pie? It shrinks under your knife. You take a knife, you try to cut it in different proportions, different slices, and as you're doing it, the pie is shrinking. And the more you're messing with the size of individual slices, the more it shrinks. And ultimately, when you think you're about to create this perfect society, so fair, so awesome, you end up with a pie like that. And then, of course, you have that pie neatly split into these slices. And so, then the question arises, would you rather live in this country producing a huge pie that ends up being cut into unequal slices? Or would you rather live in this economy that produces this pie and you're guaranteed a slice just like everybody else? One way to look at it is to ask, Would you rather have a slice like this or a slice like this? Which one is bigger?
Top one.
That one, right? You may be poor in this country compared to other people, but you have a slice of this size. Here, you're not poor, you're just like everybody else. And you have a slice just like everybody else. But it's a slice that's a fraction of the slice over here. So what happened to the rest of the slice? Where is it? It vanished. That's the deadweight loss. It's a real loss. That's really how it works. I mean, I was born in a country that just several years before I was born was still among 10 most industrialized countries. By the time I finished my college, it was a country that was producing really small pie. I was an assistant professor of economics in a European country. And I couldn't afford a car. I couldn't afford an apartment. Not a house. A professional. Why? Because the country didn't produce enough of them. There was not enough houses being built. There were not enough cars being produced. Not enough apartments being built. The country simply did not produce enough goods and services, and as a result, people only had very little. That's exactly how it works. That makes sense? That's the meaning of deadweight loss. This is why, guys, you need to care about what policies are implemented, what policies are not implemented. Because it really does happen. You know, the more inefficient policies you implement, the bigger deadweight loss you're generating, the bigger damage to the economy you're doing, the smaller the pie you end up with. It's serious. Now, of course, that again brings up that question we talked about in the last class. If just about every policy, guys, causes inefficiency and shrinks the size of the pie, why have policies to begin with? Why don't we just quit using those policies and just let the pie be as big as it possibly can? Do you remember? We had that chat. But if you simply stop implementing any policies, you can basically get rid of government. You don't need the government, right? If you don't have government, you don't have policies. And you create that perfect economy in the sense producing the biggest pie. It may be unequally cut, but hey, it's a big pie. Is that the way the world works? Just ask Somalis, right? They live in that awesome country with no government. How much of a pie do they bake? None. They're dying of hunger. So what's going on? You implement policies, you're shrinking the pie. You get rid of the government, you have no policies, you have no pie. Who's supposed to make sense of this, guys? The world is uncomfortably complicated. Can you make any sense of it? What should we do, guys? Well, look. We learned from the experience of others, we learned from our own experience, that in order to bake a pie to begin with, you have to have what?
Ingredients.
Rule of law, enforcement of contracts, judicial system, right? In other words, you have to have the government. You must have the government. Otherwise, you bake no pie. By the way, some people think that, yeah, I mean, you know, you can definitely say that about those strange countries elsewhere, but here in America it works differently. How would America work without a government, guys? Do you have any idea? Just ask people in New Orleans, right? How was it during Katrina? When the government decked out and left them alone. How was life there?
It's terrible.
Terrible, right? Total chaos. Mayhem. So you have to have government to have law and order, enforcement of contracts, all those good things. You have to have government. But if you have the government, if you have judges, if you have cops, you have to pay them. Where does the government get the money to pay cops and judges?
Taxes.
Taxes. So the government has to tax you. Is tax a policy? Yes. Does it cause inefficiency? Of course. So you have to have a government and you have to have a policies that potentially cause certain inefficiencies. So how are you going to balance this? On the one hand, you want to increase efficiency. At the same time, to have some efficiency and bake that pie, you have to have a government and policies that reduce efficiency. What should we do? How should we do it, guys? Well, what we have to do is balance it, right? To have just the right amount of government to make sure that the economy produces that pie as efficiently as possible. And at the same time, to feed and run that government in a way that causes the minimum
Resources.
inefficiency, or ties up minimum resources and causes minimum inefficiency, right? In other words, you really have, it's a balancing act. It's a very fine balancing act. Do we always get it right? No. But we learn along the way. And you're just another unlucky generation that has to learn about it, right? It's not a whole lot of fun, but this is the way it's done. You analyze policies, you analyze their efficiency impact, and you're trying to maximize the benefit, minimize the negative consequences, the inefficiencies. That makes sense? So this is why it's done. Very, very good. Look guys, we still have 20 minutes left. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce the last set of policies we're going to analyze in this session, and that is a tax and subsidy. I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to motivate them. I'm not going to crunch numbers today because that would be cruel and unusual. We have laws against that in the United States at this point of the session. So we're going to definitely do that on Tuesday. Okay, on Tuesday we'll crunch the numbers. You will see how it works. Once we're done with tax and subsidy on Tuesday, I will introduce the last topic associated with policy analysis, and that's elasticity. Elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply. You will then see what those are important for, how they fit in the overall debate, and so on and so forth. The important thing is, we're still good? Yeah. Power is, thank you very much. So once you see how elasticity fits in the overall narrative, you see all the policies with their consequences on efficiency, output, prices, and all that, you are ready to take the first midterm, okay? So sometimes in the next week, sometimes in the next class, we're gonna start planning for the first midterm, all right? So we're doing very well, guys. We're well ahead of the midpoint of this semester, and we're already getting in shape to wrap up the material we're responsible for in the first half of the session. Once we're done with that, we will enter the second half of the session and then start talking about more detailed analysis of supply and so on and so forth. I'll tell you about that later. So now let me use the time. Now let me use the time to introduce tax and subsidy. Now when it comes to homework assignments, please check your email, check the Blackboard. I'll post an announcement, I'll send you an email with instructions what to do, when it's due, and so on and so forth, okay? So, tax and subsidy. Subsidy. First of all, intuitively, what is a tax?
Money you pay on goods that you buy.
Money you pay on goods you buy. For example, I'll sell you my old car for $5,000. Is that a tax? You paid me $5,000?
No.
You just paid $5,000 for a good,
Mm.
and you're saying it's not the tax.
No.
So what is a tax?
Government money takes from us.
The money the government takes from us, right? Or the money you
Okay,
pay to the government or give the government, right? One way or another.
well, they really take it.
the government is really taking it, okay?
Money paid for your public goods and services?
Very good. What's the difference between the way tax was characterized by your two colleagues, guys? This guy says it's money you give to the government, or it's the money the government takes away from you. That colleague is saying it's the money you pay for public goods and services provided by the government.
But that money is being used,
Whereas this money is just being
get
taken, right? In other words, you describe tax as the money the government takes away from you. You describe tax as the source of money that's being used to do something,
Like this
right?
Yes.
deposit
Yes.
services.
That's it. That's the result.
Well, a resource for producing public goods and services,
Yeah.
right? Here, it's going to be really, really broken down into the simplest possible constituent parts. So we will go with your characterization, where the government takes your money in some shape or form, in other words, taxes you, and then we'll ask, what does the government use that tax revenue for? What does the government use the tax revenue for? Provision of some kind of public goods and services, right? So that's exactly what we're going to do here. The government is going to impose a tax, but it's not just going to impose a tax to make you mad. The government is going to impose a tax in order to generate tax revenue. Okay? Tax revenue of the government. What's the purpose of generating tax revenue? So that the government can provide some benefit. Now, the government could provide all kinds of benefits. In this particular analysis, the government will impose a tax and generate tax revenue in order to provide a subsidy. What is a subsidy? How would you describe a subsidy to someone? Someone asks you, hey, what's subsidy? Funny word. What is it?
Like a highway? Like a service?
Highway service. What do you mean?
Like,
If the government, okay, how are interstate highways built in America? I-95. How does it work, guys? Just so we have some intuition.
Through public.
Because people say that the government builds highways. Have you ever seen President Obama with a big shovel working somewhere in downtown Jacksonville trying to move the traffic?
The government hire
Yes?
private sector to do it.
Okay. So who actually builds the highway? Who does the job?
Contractors,
Contractors.
construction workers.
Contractors, in other words, private
Sec-
companies that hire workers, right?
Yes.
So guys, the government doesn't build that road. Private companies build that road. Just like private companies built the apartment building where you're living, just like private farmers grew the corn that you're eating for breakfast, right? Also, highways in America are built by private companies. So why do people say government built it?
Because it comes from money.
Doesn't pay the workers.
In other words, the issue is not who built it, the issue is who paid for it, right?
Yeah.
Who paid for it. And so when people say public highways, it's not because they were built by government, it's because they were paid for by the government, right? Now, you suggested highways. I asked you, what is a subsidy? You said highways. Does it mean that when the government pays for building I-95, it is subsidizing?
No.
Look guys, the easiest way to think of a subsidy is to think of it as an opposite of a tax. Basically, mirror image of a tax. If a tax is imposed on you, that means somehow the government is getting your money, right? One shape or another. Subsidy is the opposite, where you benefit by getting the money from the government.
I
Okay?
just got health insurance through the Obamacare, was that pre-existing? And so
Okay.
they had like a tax subsidy credit.
Oh, there you go.
Mhm.
Tax subsidy or
Like a credit.
tax credit or tax subsidy, absolutely. Now, does that apply only to Obamacare beneficiaries, this tax subsidies
No,
or tax credits?
no.
What else can you get a tax credit for in America?
Student loans?
Student loans, so I guess some are somehow, you can qualify for some credits, right?
Is like HUD housing and stuff like that, Section 8, is
Possibly,
that
I
a
don't know
subsidy?
enough about that.
Oh.
I'm sure there are some subsidies associated with that. Are you guys familiar with EIC? Anyone qualifies for that?
Earned income credit
Earned income credit. What is that?
is, a part of your taxes that the government gives back to citizens that does not make enough to support their family.
In other words, if you have a family, mom, dad, 2 children, and they have an annual income of, let's say, $20,000 per family. They're working, they're earning money. How much in federal income tax does the government collect from that?
Less than 2%.
After you account for the earned income credit,
Oh, no.
you actually qualify for negative tax. Instead of you sending check to the US Treasury, you just file your taxes, send nothing, and a couple of weeks later you get a check from the US Treasury. Okay?
Is that the welfare?
No,
No.
it's not welfare. I mean, it depends on what you mean by welfare, but no, it's earned income credit.
And they can even get it on their, they can even take it out through the year on their regular pay.
Absolutely. I mean, there are various ways it can be implemented, but it's basically negative tax. Instead of you paying
Interesting.
on April 15th, sending money to the government will send money to you.
That's good.
That's subsidy. Okay, that's one form of subsidy. So here, we're going to be studying 2 policies, tax and subsidy, side by side, so that first of all, you obviously appreciate how, mirror image, how they are basically a mirror image of each other. Number one. Number two, you will also see that typically policies such as tax are being implemented in order to do something with that tax revenue. Not just to make you mad, not just to take money away from you, but to actually use that money the government collects to implement some other policy that costs money. Now, there are obviously various ways the government can collect taxes from you. Can you think of some ways or some various forms of taxes you guys are paying? We mentioned some of them.
Lottery.
Say it loud.
The lottery.
The lotteries may be thought of as a form of tax, absolutely. Any other taxes you guys pay? Now, do all of you play lottery periodically every week? No. Some people do, some people don't. Does it mean those of you who don't play lottery periodically don't pay taxes? Do you pay taxes even if you don't play lottery?
But they
So what taxes do you pay?
they benefit from, like, a lot of the proceeds that go into the lottery go back into education.
Okay,
So,
some people pay the tax, other people benefit from it.
like, we're benefiting from,
We, you mean students, right?
yeah.
Because a lot of proceeds from lottery sales, lottery ticket sales, are used to pay for education in states, right? That's true, absolutely. But like I mentioned, you only pay that tax if you buy a lottery ticket. If you don't buy a lottery ticket, it means you pay no tax. Or do you pay some taxes? What other taxes do you pay, other than lottery?
Income taxes.
Income tax, absolutely, right? Every American who earns money above certain level, every year you have to fill out your 1040 by April 15, right?
Sales tax.
Sales tax, absolutely. What do you pay sales tax on?
Everything.
Just about everything you buy, right? There are perhaps some articles that are exempt from sales tax, but pretty much everything else you pay sales tax on. Absolutely. So you pay sales taxes, you pay income taxes. If you choose to buy a lottery ticket, you can think of it as a tax.
Property
Any other
tax.
property taxes? Absolutely, right?
If you live in a state that has its state income tax, Florida doesn't.
And if you live in a state that has state income tax, you also have to pay state income tax. Absolutely. So you see there's plenty of these taxes, right? There are some taxes, have you ever heard of excise taxes?
Yes.
Excises. What are excises, excise taxes?
It's been a while.
I know, I can't.
Okay, let me give you a hint.
Yeah, give me.
Some people call it sin taxes. Now in
Like-
syntax, but sin tax.
Alcohol.
Oh,
Yeah, tobacco.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. So it's those taxes that the government imposes on some
Tanning
articles.
taxes.
Say it again?
Tanning, at the tanning.
I
shop,
guess
they
tanning,
charge an extra
possibly.
Tax, they do.
There you go. Now, what is the difference between your ordinary sales tax and the sin tax, such as tax on alcohol?
The rate,
That's already in the price.
Okay, so what's the sales tax rate in Florida?
7.
7%. Okay, what's the tax on a half gallon of liquor?
15, I don't know.
Isn't it already added into the price?
Well, that's the point.
You just.
But it's added to the price, not as a percentage. It is added as a dollar amount. Okay? So sales tax is proportional tax. It's added as a percentage, right? 7% of the total. Whereas some taxes, excise taxes, that's why we have separate name for them. We don't just call them sales taxes. Excise taxes are added as percentage per unit. Oftentimes cigarettes, right? There's a tax on a pack of cigarettes, a certain amount. Or a half gallon of liquor, a certain amount. Yes?
Gas is the same way too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's fixed in.
And that's not sin, right? Do you feel sinful when you're filling her up? There you go.
That sucks.
So, but yeah, excise taxes. Now, there's another word for excise taxes, and it's called, for the way excise taxes are imposed, it's called specific tax. Specific tax. It means you're adding a specific dollar amount on a unit of a good. Not as a percentage of price, but as, whatever, $3 per half gallon of liquor.
Who's getting taxed though? Is the consumer getting taxed or is the producer getting taxed?
Very good. Well, we will try and see the effects of both. We will impose a tax on consumers. We will impose a tax on producers. Because the government oftentimes uses that tax for all kinds of purposes. For example, the government taxes cigarettes, right? But what does it mean to tax cigarettes? Are you taxing smokers or are you taxing Philip Morris? And it depends on how you look at it, right? Yes, you have a...
I was gonna say, if they tax the producer, they're just gonna charge the consumer more, right? To make up for it.
Well, we'll
They
see
get
what
both
happens.
ones.
That's exactly part of our analysis. How does it change the behavior of firms, consumers, and so on and so forth? But do you understand why the government sometimes may prefer to tax firms, at other times the government may choose to tax consumers? For example, when it turned out, I don't know if you remember, if you've ever seen those movies about the whistleblowers in the tobacco industry. I think it was like late 80s or in the 90s when those people, former executives of tobacco companies, finally came forth and were openly discussing those horrible tactics of tobacco companies trying to deceive the public about the harmful effects and how they change the chemistry of the tobacco just to make you more hooked and stuff like that, right? I mean, there were these huge trials. And of course the public turned against the tobacco companies as bad actors, bad corporate citizens. And so of course there was great sentiment to punish those companies. Let's just impose taxes on them, right? On the other hand, some people feel like, well, what do you mean? I mean, smokers are smokers. They choose to smoke. And they wouldn't have to smoke. They're harming their own health. They're polluting the environment where we all live. Smokers don't deserve our empathy. We should punish smokers with tax. So some people feel like, okay, let's impose tax on the smokers. Other people say, no, it's the companies, they're the bad ones. Smokers are victims. They're sick, basically. Addiction is a disease. So we should punish those companies. How do you feel, guys? Well, regardless of how you feel, we will show that when you impose a specific tax on a producer, it has exactly the same economic impact as the specific tax imposed on consumer. In other words, who are you going to impose the tax on? Makes absolutely no difference. There you go. Right? That's going to be part of our analysis. So once you see that, you will see how the tax works and how the tax generates tax revenue. And then, of course, we're going to ask, what are we going to do with the tax revenue? And the policy I'm choosing to analyze is the policy called subsidy, where the government is going to subsidize another market. In other words, let's say the government decides to tax cigarette markets in order to generate tax revenue. Because, hey, those smokers don't deserve our sympathy. Let's impose tax on them, get money out of smokers. And then let's use that tax revenue to subsidize some other markets that deserves to be subsidized. Young families with children, they have it difficult, right? Have you checked the prices of baby formula lately? Oh my goodness. Let's subsidize baby formula. That's only fair, isn't it? Again, we could subsidize consumers, we could subsidize firms. Does it make any difference who we subsidize? No, just like with taxes, specific subsidy, economic effects of specific subsidy do not depend on whether you impose it on consumers or producers. So, how are we going to subsidize those families? I'm going to propose a very simple way. For example, government in Jacksonville, our city government decides that it's time to attract young professional families to Jacksonville to revitalize this economy. How are we going to do it? Let's suppose we're going to subsidize baby formula in Jacksonville. And everybody says, oh, that's great, let's do it. But where are we going to get the money? Well, let's impose additional tax on cigarettes. We will get the money out of smokers in Jacksonville and use it to subsidize young families with children, make baby formula more affordable for them. Okay, let's say now we collected the tax revenue from the smokers. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to subsidize it? I'm suggesting a very simple scheme. Let's issue city coupons. You can go to any store and you find a coupon book. And in it, there are coupons you can apply against baby formula. So you come to a cash register, they ring it up, the price comes up, you whip up your coupon, and they will reduce the balance by the value of the coupon. That make sense? So then, you as a family, you benefit, you get discounted baby formula. Now you have a baby formula, you're happy in Jacksonville. Where's the coupon? In the store. What does Publix do with that redeemed coupon?
Charges the government.
It sends it back to the government and gets what? Money, cash. Where does the government get the cash to give to Publix?
Smoker.
From the tax rate. Exactly. And so what I'm going to do on Tuesday next week, we're going to introduce cigarette market, we're going to tax it, and we're going to generate tax revenue. And then I'm going to ask you, guys, take a look at the baby formula market, completely different market. And I'm going to ask you, construct a subsidy. In other words, choose the value of a coupon that will subsidize baby formula in Jacksonville and will be fully financed by the tax revenue from the cigarette tax. And I'm going to show you how to do it. In other words, we will construct balanced budget tax subsidy policy, okay? That pays for itself. Thank you very much for your attention. See you on Tuesday.